We are KB and Jasmine, and welcome to Beyond the Silver Screen.
Yeah. This time we're going to be looking at one of the most exciting and turbulent periods in Hollywood history, the rise of the movie Brats. So just picture it, the late 60s, early 70s.
Oh, yeah.
America is grappling with the Vietnam War. The counterculture movement is challenging everything. And then you have Hollywood, which is stuck in its old ways, clinging to a studio system that's rapidly becoming outdated. So that's the scene for today's deep dive.
Yeah, it really was like the perfect storm for something new to happen. You had the old guard, the studio heads who were totally out of touch with what young people wanted.
Right, they wanted something different.
They wanted authenticity and grit. They wanted films that reflected the world they were living in, not the polished, sanitized version that Hollywood had been peddling for decades.
Yeah, and that's where these so-called movie brats come in.
Exactly.
They weren't just making movies, they were shaking things up, breaking rules, and really changing the face of cinema.
Yeah, they were young and hungry filmmakers. They were influenced by European art cinema, and they had this burning desire to tell stories that resonated with their own generation.
And some of them went on to become the biggest names in Hollywood. We're talking
Huge names.
Francis Ford, Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas.
Yeah, all names we know and love.
But today we're going to dive deep into their early years, their struggles, their triumphs, and really try to understand their impact on the industry.
I'm excited for this one.
Me too. So let's start with the landscape of Hollywood at the time. We know the old studio system was crumbling. But how did that create an opening for these young rebels to make their mark?
Well, the studios were losing money, plain and simple.
Makes sense.
Their big-budget musicals and historical epics were flopping, while smaller independent films like Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider were capturing the zeitgeist and making a ton of money.
Those two films are always mentioned as being catalysts for this new Hollywood movement. What made them so groundbreaking?
Well, they were raw. They were violent, and they were morally ambiguous, which was a far cry from the traditional hero narratives that Hollywood had been churning out for decades.
Right, it was something totally new.
Like Bonnie and Clyde romanticized outlaws and kind of blurred the lines between art film and commercial cinema.
I love that film.
It also used these really innovative editing techniques like jump cuts and slow motion to heighten the violence and create a sense of stylized realism.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the style that was different. These films tackled themes that were relevant to a younger audience. Disillusionment, rebellion, this search for identity in a world that felt increasingly chaotic.
Absolutely. And then Easy Rider took it a step further.
Yeah, Easy Rider was...
It was a road movie, a counterculture anthem that celebrated freedom, individuality, and, let's be honest, use.
It's amazing to think that a low-budget biker film, shot on location with a relatively unknown cast, could have such a profound impact.
It is, but that's the thing about this era. There was a real sense of possibility, this feeling that anything could happen.
Yeah, that must have been exciting to be a part of.
It was the old rules were being thrown out the window, and these young filmmakers were eager to experiment, to push boundaries, and to see how far they could take it.
And they weren't afraid to fight for their vision, right?
Yeah.
We always hear these stories about these epic battles between directors and studio executives.
Oh, absolutely. These were passionate, driven individuals. They believed in their stories, and they weren't going to compromise their artistic integrity.
I can imagine.
They challenged the studio's control over everything, casting, editing, even marketing, basically everything the studios held sacred.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster, but somehow it worked.
Yeah.
These films were not only critically acclaimed, but they were also box office hits.
Yeah, it's a testament to their talent, their tenacity, and maybe a little bit of luck, too. They caught a wave, a cultural shift that was already in motion, and they rode it to success, but it wasn't all smooth sailing.
Let's talk about some of those behind-the-scenes battles.
Yeah.
Thinking specifically about the making of The Godfather. It's considered one of the greatest films of all time.
Absolutely.
But I know it was a notoriously difficult production.
It was Francis Ford Coppola, the director, had to fight tooth and nail for his vision.
Really?
Paramount, the studio, wanted a safe, predictable gangster flick.
I guess that makes sense from their perspective.
Right, and they were really resistant to Coppola's casting choices, particularly Marlon Brando as Don Corleone.
Oh, yeah. Brando was a legend, but he also had a reputation for being difficult.
He did.
So I guess the studio saw him as a risk.
A huge risk, and they also weren't thrilled about the budget overruns or the film's lengthy runtime.
I bet.
There were even threats to replace Coppola during production.
Wow. So how did he manage to pull it off?
Well, he had a clear vision. He was strong-willed, and maybe most importantly, he had a knack for getting people on his side.
He needed that.
He convinced the studio to trust him, and in the end, he delivered a masterpiece.
And the Godfather success really proved that these young directors could handle big budgets and deliver commercial hits without sacrificing their artistic vision.
It did. It was a turning point for the industry. It showed that audiences were hungry for something more than just escapist entertainment.
Right.
They wanted substance, they wanted complexity, and they wanted characters they could connect with on an emotional level.
So we've got these rebellious filmmakers making waves, challenging the studio system and creating some of the most iconic films of all time, but they still needed someone to champion them, someone to give them the resources and the creative freedom to bring their visions to life. That's where Bert Schneider and BBS Productions come in, right?
Exactly. Schneider was a fascinating figure, a maverick who came from a wealthy family but had a deep appreciation for art and counterculture.
Interesting.
He saw the potential in these young filmmakers and was willing to take risks that the established studios wouldn't.
So BBS became this haven for the movie brats, a place where they could experiment, push boundaries, and create films that were truly their own.
That's exactly right. BBS wasn't just a production company, it was a community, a collective of like-minded individuals who were all pushing the boundaries of cinema in their own way.
And they gave us some great films.
They did The Last Picture Show, Five Easy Pieces, and even Head, which was that surreal, psychedelic musical starring the Monkees.
Oh, wow. Head sounds like a wild ride. I bet that one ruffled a few feathers.
It certainly did. It was a far cry from the lighthearted, family-friendly fare the Monkees were known for.
Yeah, but that was the beauty of BBS. They weren't afraid to take risks, to challenge conventions, and to trust their filmmakers to follow their creative instincts. And that creative freedom led to some truly groundbreaking work.
Oh, yeah.
One film that comes to mind is The Last Picture Show, directed by Peter Bogdanovich. It was a critical and commercial success, a beautifully crafted coming-of-age story set in a dying Texas town.
The Last Picture Show was a turning point for BBS. It showed that they could produce not just edgy counterculture films, but also nuanced, character-driven dramas that could appeal to a wider audience.
It's interesting how BBS seemed to straddle both worlds, the art house and the mainstream. They were able to make films that were both commercially successful and critically acclaimed, which is a rare feat.
It's a testament to Schneider's vision and his ability to nurture talent. He gave these young filmmakers a platform, a support system, and the freedom to experiment.
So we've got the cultural upheaval, the crumbling studio system, the hungry young directors, and the maverick production company.
It's all coming together.
Now let's dive into some of the other films that defined this era, starting with MASH, Robert Altman's black comedy that took aim at the Vietnam War and sparked a national controversy.
Ash was a brilliant example of how the movie Bratz used humor to tackle serious issues. It was a scathing satire of the military and the absurdity of war, but it also had a lot of heart.
And it was a huge hit despite the controversy.
It was.
Altman's filmmaking style was also revolutionary. He used overlapping dialogue, handheld cameras, and a loose improvisational approach that gave the film a sense of realism and immediacy.
Yeah, Altman was a master of ensemble filmmaking.
I can see that.
He gave his actors a lot of freedom to improvise and create their own characters, which resulted in some of the most memorable performances of the era.
And MASH cemented Altman's status as a major force in Hollywood. He would go on to direct a string of critically acclaimed films in the 1970s, each one pushing the boundaries of cinematic storytelling in its own unique way.
He was a true auteur, a visionary who refused to be pigeonholed.
And speaking of auteurs, we can't talk about this era without mentioning Warren Beatty. He was a movie star, a heartthrob, but he was also incredibly savvy about the business side of Hollywood.
Beatty had a real knack for finding and developing projects that were both commercially viable and artistically challenging.
He sounds like he was a force to be reckoned with.
He was instrumental in getting Bonnie and Clyde made, and he also produced and starred in Shampoo, which was a satirical look at the Hollywood lifestyle that was pretty risque for its time.
Yeah, Shampoo dealt with infidelity, sexual liberation, and the fading allure of the hippie dream, which were pretty taboo subjects in the early 70s.
Exactly. It was a sharp, witty film that captured the mood of a generation that was coming to terms with the fact that the revolution hadn't quite lived up to its promises.
It's amazing how Beatty managed to balance his star persona with his desire to make films that were both entertaining and thought-provoking.
He was a rare breed, a movie star who was also a serious artist, and he used his clout to get projects made that might not have otherwise seen the light of day.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the cultural context, the key players, the battles with the studios, and some of the groundbreaking films that emerged from this era, but there's still So much more to explore,
Definitely.
but we're going to have to save that for next time.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it. Picking up where we left off last time, I think it's interesting how the movie Bratz had to walk this line between artistic expression and commercial success.
Yeah, they had to make a living.
They did. They wanted to make films that matter, but they also wanted to reach a wide audience.
It's that age-old dilemma, isn't it? Art versus commerce. But these filmmakers were in this unique position to bridge that gap.
They were.
I mean, they had their fingers on the pulse of the culture. They understood what audiences were craving.
They did, and they weren't afraid to push the envelope either. Take Steven Spielberg, for example.
Spielberg, he was definitely part of that movie brat generation, but he always had this knack for crafting crowd-pleasing entertainment.
He did.
It's no wonder he's often called the master of the blockbuster.
Yeah, and it all really started with Jaws back in 1975.
That film terrified an entire generation. It redefined what a summer movie could be.
It did.
But what's so remarkable about Jaws is how Spielberg used those technical limitations to his advantage.
Oh, yeah. That mechanical shark they built.
He was a nightmare.
It was notoriously unreliable.
Yeah.
So he had to rely on suggestion on what the audience didn't see to build suspense.
Wow, that's so interesting. He created this sense of dread and anticipation by focusing on the reactions of the characters, the ominous music, the glimpses of the shark's fin slicing through the water.
Yeah.
It's a masterclass in suspense filmmaking.
It is. And that score by John Williams.
Oh, the music is iconic.
Those two notes.
You hear those notes and
That signal impending doom.
you instantly think of Jaws.
They're forever etched in our collective memory.
You're right. Spielberg really understood the power of sound and image to create this visceral cinematic experience. And he wasn't afraid to experiment with new technologies and techniques.
He was a true innovator.
His influence on Hollywood is undeniable.
He paved the way for the modern blockbuster era.
He did, but he always brought a certain level of craft and intelligence to his films that really set them apart.
He did.
I think he understood that audiences wanted to be entertained, of course,
Of course.
but they also wanted to be moved to think, to feel something.
Right.
And that's a legacy that continues to this day.
Absolutely. Another filmmaker who left an indelible mark on this era was Martin Scorsese.
Scorsese, oh yeah, he brought this gritty urban realism to his films that was unlike anything we'd seen before.
He did. His films were raw, violent, and often deeply personal. He explored themes of guilt redemption and the struggle for identity in a world that felt chaotic and unforgiving.
And he found the perfect collaborator in Robert De Niro.
Oh, yeah. Their collaborations on films like Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, and Raging Bull are legendary.
Legendary. They pushed each other to their creative limits,
Yeah.
and they created some of the most unforgettable characters in cinema history.
Absolutely. Taxi Driver, in particular, is a film that continues to resonate today.
It's a classic.
It's this chilling portrait of urban alienation and the psychological toll of violence.
Scorsese's use of light and shadow, his unflinching camera work, and De Niro's haunting performance as Travis Bickle.
Yeah, just amazing.
It all adds up to a truly unforgettable cinematic experience.
It does.
It's a film that gets under your skin and stays with you long after the credits roll.
It does, but it sparked a lot of controversy at the time. Some critics accused it of glorifying violence.
It's definitely a challenging film.
It is, for sure, but I think Scorsese's intent was to explore the darkness that exists within all of us, the potential for violence that lurks beneath the surface of even seemingly ordinary people.
Yeah, and he did so with an artistry and a psychological depth that few filmmakers could match.
Exactly. Speaking of challenging films, we can't forget about Francis Ford Coppola and Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now. It's a war film,
It is.
but it's also so much more than that.
It is so much more. It's this surreal, nightmarish journey into the heart of darkness.
A meditation on the madness of war and the fragility of the human psyche.
Exactly. And the making of Apocalypse Now is almost as legendary as the film itself.
Oh, the stories I've heard.
The production was plagued with problems. You had typhoons, drug use, Marlon Brando showing up overweight and unprepared.
Oh, wow.
It was chaos, and Coppola himself went through a kind of breakdown during filming. He pushed himself and everyone around him to their limits.
But out of that chaos, he created a masterpiece.
Yeah, he did. It's a film that defies easy categorization. It's a war epic, a psychological thriller, a visual tone poem. It's a testament to Coppola's ambition, his vision, and his willingness to risk everything for his art.
And to think that almost didn't get made.
I know it's amazing, but Apocalypse Now also marked a turning point in Hollywood,
How so?
It was a huge financial risk, and its success was far from guaranteed.
Right.
And it came in a time when the studios were starting to regain control, to pull back on the reins after years of giving these young directors free rein. The era of unbridled creative freedom was coming to an end.
So even though the movie Bratz had achieved this incredible success, there were cracks starting to show in the foundation of this new Hollywood.
Exactly. The studios had learned from their mistakes.
Yeah.
They realized that they could capitalize on the trends that the movie Bratz had set in motion,
Yeah.
but they wanted to do it on their own terms.
They wanted the box office returns without the risk, the creative vision without the creative clashes.
Exactly. And that's where we start to see the rise of the blockbuster, the big budget special effects driven spectacles that would come to dominate the 80s and beyond.
So did the movie Bratz inadvertently pave the way for their own demise?
It's a complex question. They changed the game, but they also changed the rules of the game. And as we'll see next time, the studios were quick to adapt and ultimately reclaim their power.
Last time we were talking about how the studios were starting to regain control in Hollywood after kind of losing their grip for a while.
Yeah, they were taking notes, watching the movie Bratz closely, seeing what worked and what didn't.
And realizing that they could make a lot of money by following those trends.
Exactly. They saw the box office success of those more character-driven films, the ones that tackled complex themes, and they realized audiences were hungry for something different from the tired formulas they'd been relying on for so long.
Right. They wanted a piece of that action, but they also wanted to do it their way.
Of course they wanted to maintain control.
So instead of letting these young directors run wild like they had been, they started investing in bigger budget films
Yeah.
that had the potential to reach a mass audience.
Yeah, and they also exerted more control over the whole filmmaking process from the very beginning with script development all the way to marketing.
So that's where we really see the rise of the blockbuster.
Right.
Films like Jaws and Star Wars, they proved that audiences were hungry for spectacle and escapism.
Those films were event movies. They were experiences that you had to see on the big screen with state-of-the-art sound and special effects.
It was something totally new.
It was a far cry from the smaller, more character-driven films that the movie Bratz had been making.
But wasn't there some pushback from the movie Bratz? I mean, they'd fought so hard for creative control. Were they just going to roll over and let the studios take over again?
Well, some of them did try to adapt to this new landscape.
They had to make a living.
They did. They realized that in order to get their films made, they had to play the studio game to some extent.
So they started making compromises.
In some cases, yes, they might have agreed to tone down the violence or add a more upbeat ending to appeal to a wider audience, but others just flat out refused to compromise their vision.
And what happened to them?
They found it increasingly difficult to get their projects financed. The studios were less willing to take risks on auteur-driven films that didn't fit neatly into the blockbuster mold.
It's like this pendulum swing, right?
It is. There's definitely a cyclical nature to these things, but even though their reign was relatively short-lived, the movie Bratz had already made their mark. Their films had changed the landscape of Hollywood forever.
You mentioned earlier that the studios learned from their mistakes. What were some of those lessons?
Well, for one, they learned that audiences were hungry for more complex and realistic characters.
People wanted to see themselves on screen.
They did, and the studios also learned that films could tackle difficult and controversial subjects and still be commercially successful.
It was a whole new way of thinking about what a movie could be.
So even though the movie Bratz' reign was relatively short-lived, they had a profound impact on the industry. They helped to usher in a new era of filmmaking. One that was more diverse, more experimental, and more attuned to the realities of the world outside of Hollywood.
And their influence is still felt today.
Right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the films being made today.
Yeah, we're still seeing a lot of those big budget blockbusters, but there's also a thriving independent film scene, and streaming services are giving filmmakers more creative freedom than ever before.
That's right. And that's something the movie Bratz helped to make possible. They challenged the status quo, they took risks, and they inspired a whole new generation of filmmakers to do the same.
So I guess the question is, did the movie Bratz ultimately blow it?
I don't think so. They may have lost the battle for complete creative control, but they won the war for the hearts and minds of audiences. They left behind a body of work that continues to inspire and influence filmmakers today.
That's true, and they proved that films can be both entertaining and thought-provoking, commercially successful and artistically ambitious.
Exactly. They showed that cinema can be a powerful force for change, a way to reflect the world around us and to challenge our perceptions of it.
It's been fascinating exploring this era of Hollywood with you,
It has been fun.
and I think we've just scratched the surface.
We have. There's so much more to discover.
To our listeners, if you haven't already, we encourage you to check out some of the classic films from this era. They're not just great movies. They're a window into a time of cultural upheaval and artistic revolution.
And they remind us that even in a system that's driven by profit, there's always room for passion, vision, and a little bit of rebellion.
That's a great takeaway. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the movie
It's
Brats.
been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring those cinematic treasures and remember the power of film to challenge, inspire, and entertain.